Hello, everybody. This is Khalid Kark. I'll be your moderator today. We're looking forward to this session. This session, of course, is day one of College Promise Careers Institute. Today, we're focused on future of technology in the workforce. And I'm really excited about this panel because this really touches on something that we all care deeply about, all the panelists, including myself. Automation, digital platforms, big data, a lot of innovations coming your way and changing really fundamentally the nature of work. Earlier this year, we put together a perspective for technology leaders to think about the future of work. And this has been really, I feel, a pivotal moment for all of us to start to think about how technology is going to fundamentally shape today's work environment and the future. So the goal for today's session is to increase general understanding of the shifts that are happening in the marketplace for policymakers, business leaders, students. And we want to make sure that as part of the conversation, we engage you as well. So if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, feel free to use the chat window. We're happy to answer any questions there. Today, we've got two great panelists. I'm really excited to have Jake and Matt join me from LinkedIn and Burning Glass, and really excited and happy to share our perspectives collectively. I'll take a quick second and maybe have Matt, you introduce yourself first, and then I'll ask Jake to do the same.
Excellent. Well, Khalid, thanks so much for the opportunity to join you here, and Jake as well. And I'm Matt Sigelman. I'm the CEO of Burning Glass. For those of you that don't know us, Burning Glass is lucky to have a unique opportunity on some of the questions I know we're going to be talking about today. And that's this. So much of the work that all of you listening today are doing is about putting students first, which is exactly what we need to do. And about the and key to the promise that we need to make to students. At the same time, we realize that students view their education as a bridge to opportunity. We also owe it to them to start from the vantage point of opportunity and understand what is the nature of that opportunity. So our work is in mapping that landscape. We collect, we take a big data approach to doing that. We collect millions of jobs every day. We analyze hundreds of millions of people's careers each year, and we've created our own language to really understand not just what opportunities are looking most robust for students on graduation, how to map, help them map through programs to that success, but also we've created a language around skills. What are the skills that help people enter into their careers? What are the skills that help people move up within their careers? And to be able to, as a result, create more effective programs to help students navigate and select courses and navigate through programs. And to make sure that increasingly we're creating the sets of programs that not only serve traditional learners, but which are key to unlocking mobility for people who are already in their careers. So much to talk about today, and really looking forward to this conversation.
Of course, yeah, and we'll jump into a lot of these topics that you teed up. Jake.
Thanks so much, Khalid. So it's a complete honor to be here as well with both of you, and honestly with everybody else who's attending. It's an incredible speakers lineup, and it's a topic that could not be more pressing due to the pandemic, but really even preceding the pandemic as well. It's Jay Kirsch-Allen here. I run workforce development and higher education systems for LinkedIn Learning. And today I'm actually going to be speaking as much from my own perspective as I am on behalf of LinkedIn. And I'll try to distinguish between the two, in part because my background goes a bit beyond LinkedIn's. When they hired me, I was their weirdest hire because I started out as an international criminal lawyer. I was an intellectual property lawyer. And much of my career has been spent on how to create social impact. Most recently, through workforce development, through higher education, I founded Canada's largest software development bootcamp, which created, in essence, a new model for training people to be software developers and now a variety of other tech skills across Canada. And through that process, through other projects over the past decade, working with Gordon Brown on something called the Global Education Platform, and pioneering some of the systems work we do at LinkedIn with higher education and now in workforce development, I've begun to see some of the patterns that I think have very much come to fruition or been accelerated during this pandemic. And the opportunity now for us to leverage the labor market information that LinkedIn and Burning Glass has for us to take advantage of the online learning content that LinkedIn Learning and others, Coursera, et cetera, have been leveraging during this pandemic to help individuals learn the skills they need to get back into work. And finally, for us to really come together as a society and potentially reimagine what it looks like on the other side of this pandemic is what I'm very excited and honored to be speaking with you all about today.
Great. And I'm Khalid Kark. I am managing director at Deloitte, responsible for tech leadership and specifically workforce development and strategy for technology leaders. So I'll pepper in some of what we're hearing, seeing, sensing from that perspective. But it's really a fascinating time. And I'll maybe start with a data point that just kind of blew me away a little bit. We did research earlier this year and we asked tech leaders what percentage of your workforce is going to be relevant in 3 years. Simple question, right? And they said 2/3 of my workforce is going to be relevant in 3 years. So that means 1/3 of the workforce in technology today is not going to have the relevant skill sets, relevant competencies to operate in the future. Of course, that's a staggering number. And what I want to ask maybe both of you to start with is, what are the biggest shifts that you're seeing that are shaping in terms of your customer base? What are you seeing and sensing from your platforms or otherwise that you think are shaping how we kind of look at job markets and jobs in general? Matt, you want to start?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, I want to sort of double click on that stat you just shared because it's such an important one. And I think you spoke to this, but I think it's worth emphasizing. When people are saying that, hey, 1/3 of my workforce may no longer be relevant, it's easy to sort of think about that. We hear a lot of breathless headlines about jobs going away. And then conversely, by 2030, I think there was some statistic at some point, somebody came out with the notion that 70% of jobs that people were working with in 2030 don't exist yet. And I have no idea where that stat came from. The data simply don't support it. But here's the thing, and here's why I think the number you just shared is very real. It's not about 1/3 of jobs going away over the next 3 years. It's about the pace of skill change within jobs. And our data are really providing a very real glimpse into that. We've seen that in some jobs, as much as 40% of the skills are different today versus what they were a decade ago. Some research that was done with their data recently by Harvard economist David Deming found that. We found actually some dramatic changes in terms of how skill requirements are reshaping just over the course of the pandemic, as an example. And we've seen that both, by the way, in terms of college level jobs and also sub-BA jobs. If you were to look at insurance clerks, for example, there's been literally a 10-fold increase since the start of the pandemic in terms of risk management skills being in demand, in terms of a range of project management skills, and sort of they're becoming increasingly underwriters and much more judgment driven. So when you sort of think about those kinds of shifts, that's profound, because it says that people who are doing a job today or who have been doing a job, maybe have gotten displaced from a job, are no longer necessarily going to be ready to do that job. Even as the economy starts to recover, people who were let go, companies don't necessarily just rehire the same people they let go. They start to think ahead to what are the skills we're going to need for a future workforce. And unfortunately, people who may have been in a job for 20, 30 years may no longer have those sets of skills. So it creates, when you think about that pace of skill change, and then you compare it with the pace with which curricula change, with which programs change, it's a very different pace. And so it says, on the one hand, that we've got an imperative around our existing students, those who are going to graduate in 2021 or 2022, but potentially into this maelstrom of this economy, what kind of skills they need to have and what we can do now before it's too late. to make sure they have the sets of skills that will give them relevance and currency. But then it's also a question of how do we unlock some of those skills that are being taught in a lot of curricula, and make them available to a wider community of learners, to people who are out in their careers, who have been working in fields, now all of a sudden need to learn new things that are often orthogonal to the careers they've been on, right? If you're a marketing manager, I'll use this example. Marketing managers are about as easy to fill as any professional level job. They make about $77,000 a year. A marketing manager who can manipulate customer data, which, that's what marketing is today, and has a skill as basic as, for those in the audience who are tech fluent, as basic as SQL skills with a marketing manager role. You go from $77,000 a year and really quick to fill to about $101,000 a year and really long time to fill that role. That's the ability to help marketing managers pick up SQL or other database skills, which is stuff that schools are teaching right now. That's a huge unlock. So there's a huge opportunity here. There's a challenge in that you can wind up seeing a lot of careers get displaced. There's a challenge in that our curricula to date generally don't keep up with this pace. But there's also a big opportunity for institutions that can unlock the value of their curricula, can align them with the kind of reskilling that's or the skill dynamism that's going on, to really serve a much bigger community of learners.
Yeah, no, that's really great, and of course, I'd add to say that not all of those jobs are going away by any stretch of imagination. In fact, I'm talking to many of the technology leaders that are putting in multi-million-dollar programs to reskill their workforce, right? And so, of course, they've got the knowledge within the organization to carry on and do those jobs that are being created a lot more effectively as well. So of course that's and I think the other thing that I'd like to just kind of point to is, in that research, what we realized was automation was a big part of it, right? In tech, automation is really big. And there's a book by an MIT professor, Tom Malone, called Superminds, which basically makes the argument that automation is actually going to increase the jobs. It's going to increase our productivity. It's going to increase our ability to do our jobs much more effectively, not take away jobs. As Matt, you pointed out, there's some interesting statistics out there that are just kind of mind-boggling in terms of job loss. It's not about that, absolutely. Jake, do you want to introduce yourself?
Happy to jump in. And in fact, I'll pick up on what Matt was saying. First, from the LinkedIn perspective, I completely agree the jobs aren't disappearing, but there is a competition for them. And in fact, one of the results of the pandemic, to pick up on what a gentleman who runs a blog called Stratechery was describing as the final coming of the internet age, right? For the past few decades, everybody's been talking about moving from an industrial age to an internet age, but the revolution sort of was accelerated and happened during this pandemic, which also suggests that that marketing individual could actually now be based in Europe or based in Latin America or based in India instead of being based in the US to an even greater extent than before, right? On the trends we're seeing on LinkedIn are certainly that there's more remote work, certainly that more people are learning online, certainly that the way jobs are going to be done is going to involve technology to a greater degree than before the pandemic. And what that means is people need those technology skills in order to do maybe the exact same job they were doing before. But as one moves from, let's say, a project manager to an agile scrum master, what are the differences in skills? And I think what our organizations are able to help with is both what those skills are, and then in the case of LinkedIn Learning, how to acquire them. There was a new tool we released just in the past couple of weeks called Career Explorer. And this is perfect for students because what allows them to do is look at what skills they have now, or let's say, they're thinking about that project management job. They can type in project manager, and then it'll tell them, as Matt suggested, what the orthogonal skill sets, what the orthogonal jobs with similar skill sets, I should say, are. So what else can you be as a project manager if your job's gone, but there are a bunch of other jobs that actually require similar skill sets? And my favorite examples in this respect, to switch sort of more to the personal front, actually come from a lot of the work we do with newcomers. So I've got sort of 3 examples of job transitions like that that we might not have thought of had we not had the labor market information that tech companies currently have, or the agility to sort of move people from one job to another. So up here in Canada, where I'm based, there's a ton of Syrian newcomers. And a lot of the poorest, the most government-sponsored newcomers from Syria are bricklayers. We don't need that many bricklayers in Canada right now, but there's a lot of other jobs, delivery work, for instance, which actually have a lot of overlap with bricklaying. And so by training individuals on the relatively limited number of additional skills, aside from, of course, language skills, it's important for us maybe later on to jump back to the soft skills part of this conversation, that we can move them from bricklayer into delivery worker, as an example. A more comical but perhaps topical example is the movement from bartending to emergency call response. Bartenders make great 911 call responders. Why? Because they love that chaos. They love that interaction. They love that managing all of these people in real time, calming them down, getting them happy, etc. And so again, what do we need a lot of right now? Not so many bartenders, because people probably shouldn't be at bars during the pandemic. A lot more 911 call responders, unfortunately. The last example I'll give is sort of at an organizational level. And again, these are more from sort of my personal interactions than anything I've done at LinkedIn. But somebody described how a fast food chain, a global fast food chain, had just moved a huge percentage of its employees into new roles because they weren't delivering food anymore. They weren't serving. Instead, the folks who had some graphic design skills were literally making the posters that directed people to, navigate these restaurants in different ways as a result of COVID. The folks with project management skills were organizing new teams to come up with a different way that this restaurant chain would run. And I think it's that dynamism, both at the individual level and at the organizational level, that tech companies like ours can help support with our labor market information, with our tools. But really, it's got to come from people and the organizations that they run. And I'm hopeful that we can actually seize this moment, employ that creativity, and emerge stronger.
I think a lot of this really comes back to creating a language. So much of what Jake just described is about creating a language of skills. Right now, the language of the academy is, for the most part, not a language of skills. It's a language of learning outcomes, which is very important. But it's not necessarily a language that aligns with the landscape of opportunity. When you actually sort of get to a question of skills, that's where you can really start to look at questions of mobility more significantly. And I think what Jake was just describing is this question of how do you identify how adjacent jobs are, what are the next stops essentially between jobs. The distance between jobs is skills, and the ability to take somebody's existing role and be able to say, what's the next step that she could go into depends on being able to understand sort of that skill genome underlying each of them. Okay, well, this job, being a bricklayer, requires these skills. Here's other skills that can capitalize on a lot of the same thing. What that means is that we can make learning much more real time. We can make it much more accessible. And we can make it much more of a part of an ongoing journey, as opposed to this sort of thing where you have to step out of a career, learn, and then maybe fit back in. The part of the reason why I think this is so important right now, not only because we have so many people whose careers have been displaced, but I think it's also key to the equity imperative of this moment. A lot of companies, I think, very sincerely want to make good on their equity commitments, are striving to do better, and yet at the same time, we know that historically, a lot of very sincere commitments haven't been kept. The percentage of Black men in the C-suite, for example, has gone up by 0.5% over the last 30 years, despite, I think, some very good intentions. Part of the problem is that companies tend to look right now and sort of think about the world of talent as a zero-sum game. There's a limited number of people of color or women in a given field, and they just have to compete more aggressively for that talent. the reality is when you can use that same idea that Jake was just describing, this idea of skill adjacency, then what you can do is you can actually say, wait a second, there are other talent pools that can have. Mobile app developers, for example, are 9% women. A great job, makes $120,000 a year on average. Definitely not the same job, but worth bearing in mind that web designers are 52% women, make only $60,000 a year. Web designer to web developer is a trainable, again, just as from bricklayer to whatever comes next from bricklayer there's a finite set of skills. There is a finite set of skills that you can train somebody on relatively quickly because you're building on what she already knows and help that person move to being a web developer to mobile app developer, same thing. And you wind up moving from 52% women talent pool to a 9% female talent pool from people who are making $60,000 a year to people who are making 120. So I think so much of how we can and how our education systems can play a really critical role in driving greater community equity is in aligning what we teach to these kinds of points of transition.
Yeah, Matt, that's a really good point because what we are telling leaders is to actually look beyond the traditional skill set, right? And again, there's a book by a Stanford professor, The Fuzzy and the Techie, and that makes really the argument. By the way, fuzzies are humanities majors at Stanford, right? So you kind of comparing the two, and his argument is you actually need both in your organizations. You need the techies and you need the fuzzies, and a lot of times leaders tend to kind of focus on, I want these technical skills and that's all I need. I think what we're encouraging and we're seeing leaders really embrace is that you need that balance of and diversity in thinking, as well as, of course, other types of diversity to really bring in the right type of skills that are going to balance out your organization. I know, just kind of building on the examples, we had a client who was a hospitality client, and during COVID, of course, a lot of their operators weren't able to kind of work. And so we were actually able to work with that client to actually divert that workforce to responding to COVID response, right? And so having that ability to kind of pivot and adjust is going to be really important for leaders to try to understand how can I really utilize my workforce and different skill sets in a different way. So since I mentioned COVID, let's just kind of go there for a little bit and see what are you seeing in terms of the current, of course, it's that COVID has hit a lot and the pandemic has just impacted a lot of jobs and so on. How do you see this play out in terms of kind of the future dimensions of, well, first off, what is the impact, right? And then secondly, what are some of the trends around jobs, salaries, things like that? What are you seeing in the marketplace? How has COVID impacted the marketplace? And Jake, maybe you want to start with this.
Sure. And I think what I might do is continue Matt's comments about where we should be going in terms of hiring and job placement, curriculum development, et cetera. Because to be frank, I just think the pandemic has accelerated those trends. It hasn't dramatically changed them.
Sure.
In many ways, inequality is the same way. It has hit those who are disadvantaged in one way or another far, far worse than the rest of us. We're on the upper leg of the K. It is just accelerated trends that were happening beforehand. And maybe I'll punt what those trends are to Matt, but I'll start at least with what I was seeing beforehand, which was exactly what Matt was describing, a gradual realization that skills-based hiring is where we have to go if we are going to take full advantage of our workforces. If human capital is the most important kind of capital in this century, and the World Bank down to individual companies have recognized that, I think, across the board, but they've recognized it relatively superficially. And when you say leaders are, for instance, hiring now based on skills instead of based on ethnicity or based on relationships, that's fantastic. But those leaders are still a very small percentage of the total employers. And so when community colleges are thinking about, okay, how do we better engage employers? it has to be exactly based on the language that Matt was describing. And I think language is an interesting term here, right? Skills-based hiring as a language, part of that comes from the fact that people who are really technical into labor market information refer to skills ontologies, dictionaries of all of the skills, and then they map them to jobs. And if we can teach faculty members and employers, C-suite at companies, all the way down to recruiters, to speak in that language instead of the language that we have basically spoken in for human eternity, which is that of relationships, I think it will do a lot more. And that's hard for somebody coming from LinkedIn to say, right? Like, people joked forever that I was Jaked in because I was all about relationships. And that's honestly how I've gotten a lot of my career, right? Based on relationships. But that's a problem. That means that those who have those relationships will continue to do better. That is human nature. And part of what we have to do, in the same way that we sort of created government to improve society, we can do the same thing with technology. We just haven't thought about it that way. And I think it's now time, just to use this specific example, for us to use technology to move individuals from thinking about relationships, from thinking about degrees, which honestly help tenure track faculty members far more than they do students these days, into a world in which we're preparing students to describe the skills they're learning at a community college, on a job, volunteering, as a refugee, and then employers, probably most importantly, to actually hire based on those skills, which is hard because it's not easy to do at scale. Right now, I think technology will help us do that at scale eventually, but it needs a combination of motivation on the part of employers and community colleges and others, and a sort of ethical or values shift in the direction of skills focused hiring, which I think the pandemic actually again opens us a sort of Overton portal or window to do.
So Matt, Jake set you up perfectly. What are those skills that he keeps talking about? What are some of the skills?
So what's interesting is obviously, as you can imagine, there are a set of software skills, there are a set of data skills which are increasingly valuable, but there are also human skills which are becoming of actual real premium in the market, and so I think we're worth talking about both of those. What I would say, first of all, in terms of the data skills and and the software skills, the coding skills, and the like. It's worth pointing out that we tend to, our mental model of those kinds of roles is those are tech jobs, and then there's everybody else. And what we see increasingly is actually a hybridization of work. We see that jobs are increasingly picking up sets of skills from domains that are far outside of what those jobs would typically have been about. People have always had to wear a lot of different hats, but increasingly there are hats that don't tend to get worn on the same head. To wit, the example I offered before about marketing managers in SQL, but it's also true of a range of middle skill jobs, the kind of jobs that community college students would progress into, that increasingly they are digitally intensive. In fact, by our research, about 80% of middle skill jobs are, i.e., those that require more than a high school diploma, less than a college degree, are now digitally intensive. Digitally intensive middle skill jobs are growing twice as fast as those that are not digitally intensive, twice as likely to pay a living wage. So there are sets of skills that you didn't necessarily need in the past, which increasingly you do. But I think it's also worth recognizing, and this is mentioned before, that there's a human skills premium that's increasingly coming to bear. In fact, actually, the jobs that are most data driven and most tech enabled have dramatically higher demand for human skills. For example, those jobs, again, which we sort of see being hybridized the most by tech and data skills, are literally are 3 times as likely to ask for creativity skills. They're about twice as likely to ask for intensive communication skills, writing skills, and like. Much more likely to ask for, I think about 50% more likely to ask for problem solving skills, for research skills, and the list goes on. For those who are in liberal arts fields, that's very encouraging. But here's the danger, right? It's easy to look at that and say, great, we don't need to change our curriculum. We need to change what we do because the skills that we teach are in high demand. They are in high demand, but it's not an either or. And unfortunately, in the academy, we tend to sort of have this either you're vocational or you're academic in terms of your approach, and ne'er the twain shall meet. What the job market is saying is that the twain have to meet. That employers recognize that this generation is likely to, doesn't necessarily stay in jobs long, and how much of that is this generation, how much of it is that employers haven't shown long-term commitments to employees. It's not sure which is cause and which is effect, but either way, it makes sense if you think that your employees are going to leave after you're going to hire somebody, they're going to leave within 12 to 18 months. You maybe the notion that we can use all sorts of subjunctive moods about whether they should, would, whatever, invest in training those people. They probably should, but it's hard to get a return on investment for someone to leave quickly. So they do need people to bring those skills with them when they start. And so we have an obligation to make sure that students have both. The good news is, for students who acquire both sets of skills, who come with the intensive data skills, with the coding skills, but also, frankly, a range of other specialized skills in a given field, along with the core human skills, they're in very good stead. I do need to make one other point here, which is, I've focused a lot on data and coding skills because they're the ones that are most widespread and where there's the biggest gap. We recently did some work with ASA, with American Student Assistance, where we looked at what are the sort of skills that are most in demand for those who are graduating high school, and then looked at ASA surveyed teachers to understand, kind of what they think they're doing well. And unfortunately, a lot of those sets of skills, those data and coding skills, among others, and teachers said, we know our students need them. We know we're not serving our students well. There's sort of this gap. But I do think it's important to bear in mind that in any field, there are certain sets of skills which are of premium value. And it's possible to, and they aren't necessarily data skills all the time. And so a lot of what you need to do is to look at what are the sets of skills in a given field which are of growing demand. What are the ones that differentiate students? What are the ones that command higher pay premiums? If you can get to that level of specificity, you can make sure you can review your programs and make sure you're teaching the right sets of things. And to Jake's point, make sure that your students are articulating those skills.
Well, I think that plays out really nicely to some of what we're doing with tech leaders. So we ask them, there's research out there that suggests that a half-life of a skill, a technical skill today, is about 5 years. So something you've learned today is going to be obsolete in 10, right? So that's kind of the reality of skills. What we're finding is when we talk to tech leaders and ask them, what are you hiring for? And their answer is actually really interesting. What they're saying is, I know that if I need an employee for the long term, the actual technical skills they're going to use are going to change over their careers. They may have multiple careers in our organization. And the three things that I'm going to look for are creativity, cognitive flexibility, and emotional intelligence. And if I can get people with those skills and train them on tech, I know tech skills are going to change or adjust. So that becomes really an interesting paradigm for them to think about hiring. And again, we call them enduring human skills, similar to Matt, as you pointed out. I think those skills are important for technologists to acquire, and vice versa. It's important for people having those skills to understand what other skills they can acquire to balance themselves out. And so this whole notion of a T-shaped kind of career or skill is kind of having a broad knowledge across both and having depth and technical expertise across one. let's kind of change gears for a little bit. I
Just
think the
just before you do,
yeah,
Khalid,
go
I
ahead,
had one
go ahead.
thing to add, and I wanted to make this super practical because I feel like a lot of what certainly I have said, and to some extent you and Matt have said as well, has been economy wide or sort of broad. And for the faculty members or the college administrators who are on the call, I think there's a way of taking both what you just said and what Matt said and making it really concrete. The first is use labor market information. It's now available in a wide variety of forms from lots of different companies. I'm sure your college is paying for it. Get access to that labor market information, build it into your course, no matter what you're teaching. It could be English, it could be um, software development or abstract mathematics. Next, learn to communicate that to your students, and most importantly, teach them to communicate it to employers, right? So that was the communication piece Matt just said, which is if I'm in an English class, I will show a video of Oprah as an amazing communicator and then point out the skill she's using. The skills are rhetoric, the skills are, argument, the skills are debate, the skills are communication. Um, and then finally, and this is the hardest one, community colleges, all of higher ed is being unbundled. They are being unbundled as we speak. So that, for instance, LinkedIn Learning's content or Coursera's content is now as good, usually probably better than your local community college's content on how to use Excel or Oprah. And as a result, the faculty members themselves have to change, right? Their skills have to adapt because of that same 5-year time period you're describing. And so if they can adapt to think about things like the social determinants of their student success, peer-to-peer learning, work integrated learning, online learning, these are all themes that are obvious for higher ed, and yet in most cases, most faculty members that I've interacted with across the hundreds of institutions across North America that I've worked with have not made those leaps sufficiently in order to serve their students in learning to learn in a lifelong way.
One thing which I would just add to that is the importance of empowering both sides of that equation, both faculty and students, to help them be active participants in this. It's a lot of discussions around the alignment of curriculum with opportunity, with industry, are ones that a lot of institutions sort of shy away from including faculty on. They know there are a lot of sensitivities there. There are a lot of sensitivities there. My spouse is a professor of ancient Greek poetry, so I'm very cognizant of those kinds of sensitivities. But what I've seen, most successfully is when I've seen institutions that have put the data out there front and center and really sought to engage. For example, University of South Florida and University of Central Florida did collectively sort of a very interesting thing. They went to, I think it started at UCF and went to USF. They went to something like 65 departments. And in each one, they acted with the right combination of humility on the one side and confronting things sort of head on the other side, saying, you know what, we are not going to tell you what to teach, but we want you to know what employers are looking for your students to know. They realize that if faculty on the ones that don't know, exactly to Jake's point, they can't be good participants in creating curricula and in being held to account for creating curricula that help students truly prepare. And on the other side, that they were making a bet, which I think sort of significantly paid off, that most faculty want to do right by their students. And so one of the people from the provost office there described it to me as it was a wonderful image of sort of feeling like Jane Goodall, putting the bananas in the field and sort of stepping back and witnessing these really rich conversations about, well, gee, I didn't know that, in industry, nobody's using SPSS anymore. Everyone's using R or whatever, right? Okay, we can teach that just as easily. So I think, part of using labor market data is really about making it available, not just as a link on a resource page, but being part of the processes by which people engage. And the same is true of students. We want students to make effective decisions about what programs of study to major in, what courses to take. Literally think about that at the point of course registration each semester. How do I make sure that students see clear line of sight? Okay, I'm thinking about this kind of career. What are the skills that I'm going to need in order to be able to make effective entry? So that's not something that students are thinking about second semester, senior year, but it's part of how they're continually making choices. We need to empower people with information, not just centralize it.
So continuing on that a little bit, and I think it's actually relevant. Is of course technology has fundamentally shifted the way we hire, the way we are kind of the workforce is engaging with your platforms, and so maybe kind of talk a little bit about and a little bit about how where your platforms are evolving, what skills, what trends, what issues are you seeing that and how are you adjusting your platforms? How can people leverage your platforms better in order to get all of that information, Matt and Jake, that you're talking about, having that cognizance of that information? Jake, do you want to start maybe with kind of where your platform, where's LinkedIn with this, and how can people more effectively use it?
Sounds good. And I'm going to throw you for a spin again, Khalid, because I'm going to start with a question that I got in the chat, and then I'll go to the question of how LinkedIn's adapting. The question from the chat was, if we're going to move away from a credentials-based form of hiring to one that is more skills-based, how will companies adopt a common taxonomy for the skills being sought? And how do we validate that people actually have those skills? I thought it was a fantastic question, so I appreciate whoever sent it over. And in order to answer it, it actually takes me to where I was hoping to go with how we've been quite hard on community colleges. I certainly have been quite critical of the lack of change and where community colleges have to go. But the even bigger problem, to be frank, is with employers, because employers aren't hiring out of community colleges enough. They're not hiring disadvantaged populations enough. In fact, they're taking the low hanging fruit of those who look like them and sort of walk and talk like them, and then putting them into jobs, which is what we've always done. But Matt earlier suggested there's been a lot of sort of empty promises. One of the most important ones, I think, is if you look, and I'm going to point fingers here that might come back to hurt me, but if you look at the New York Jobs CEO Council, the numbers of people hired out of it, I don't actually know them off the top of my head, but they're certainly not in the hundreds of thousands that New York needs right now, right? They're nowhere near there. And I think for folks to actually take what we're saying on the employer side and apply it, what they need to do is look. Like, the question was, where does the employer find those skills ontologies? If you Google skills ontology, you'll get the ONET ones, you'll get the European ones, you'll get Burning Glass, you'll get MC, and you'll get LinkedIn. They're out there. And most of that you'll find at a sufficient level of granularity for an employer to hire for free. Certainly they can pay us for LinkedIn Talent Insights or Burning Glass equivalent or MC equivalent, but it's out there. That's one thing. You just have to have the motivation to do it. And then finally, that motivation has to be filtered down all the way through your recruiters to your hiring managers, because it's really them who decide, am I hiring somebody, again, who looks and walks and talks like me, or am I hiring somebody from a completely different background, but whose skills actually match what we're looking for best? And that's both soft and hard skills, or human and technical skills. So with that as background, I'll move to how LinkedIn's adapted. And I think it's adapting constantly and really, really fast, because not only is the market changing, but our company circumstances have changed. So as an example, we're partnering with Microsoft on a ton of huge initiatives, some of which you all have probably heard of, our parent company. But there's a global skills initiative where we've already trained over 10 million individuals using a subset of the courses on LinkedIn Learning, facilitated by the collaboration with GitHub and Microsoft. And that's sort of on the learning side of our business. On the talent solution side of our business, we're making it easier for individuals to represent that they're unemployed online, to show that they're looking for work. And we're also making it easier for recruiters to find those unemployed populations, matching them in a more effective manner than ever before, which I think is great. The next step is to get to the point where what we do is not just done within LinkedIn, but shared across employers. And there's initiatives like the T3 initiative, Open Skills Network. I created an organization called the International Council on Badges and Credentials. So this is, again, separate from LinkedIn. But these are all initiatives to do, I think, what you and Matt were suggesting, which is take those ontologies of skills, take those practices of skills-based hiring, make them as public and widespread as possible, so that it's easier. It's for everybody from the Fortune 500 to adopt, to the local car mechanic who wants to ensure that when he or she is hiring, they're doing so with skills in mind first.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. We need to make sure that this becomes fully integrated. That the kind of data and the kind of analysis that we're describing becomes fully integrated into how we structure interactions. And so much of what we've been doing at Burning Glass, in terms of our platform, has been to step back to look at what are the big challenges and opportunities that institutions are facing, and then to think about how do we help make sure that we're creating or supporting those kinds of decision ports, supporting those workflows. For example, we find that at this point at this moment, when there's so much dynamism out there, there's a growing need to be able to evaluate programs, to review programs. There's a growing need to be able to, in a time when enrollments are declining very fast, some pandemic related, but again, as Jake mentioned before, these are meta trends that have been going on well before the pandemic. To be able to identify new programs to actually expand the community of learners that can be served. Growing need to be able to do a better job of articulating the value of programs. Greater need to be able to make sure that students can actually make successful transition to careers. What we've been doing against each of those is saying, okay, how can we help create not just have a data resource that's there, but how can we actually insert data into the way that those decisions are happening? So, for example, think about reviewing programs. A lot of what our platform is now able to do is to be able to actually analyze curriculum, to be able to map curriculum to the skills that it's being taught, to make that translation of language that we were describing before, and then to be able to identify gaps and to be able to say, hey, you know what, in this curriculum, there are certain sets of things that are important for students that aren't getting taught. It's also about similarly being able to take the flip side of that and say, there's a lot of nuggets of value here. I'll give you an example of both of those. So if you think about a HR curriculum, most academic HR programs are really go back to the days of industrial labor relations. And if you go through them, you'll find that, in fact, you're teaching a lot of labor relations skills, not necessarily teaching a lot of the more modern talent management skills and the like, which are key today. So that's an example of how you can go beyond just looking at programs and saying, do we have the right portfolio of programs? Which likewise, we've been spending a lot of time saying, how do we actually provide market intelligence around, what are your peer institutions doing? Where are conferrals happening? But then also getting to the level of skills. Think about that revenue imperative. Okay, well, there are sets of skills that that are valuable that you're teaching inside your courses. How do you help to unlock them? And so call out nuggets of value that are in and of themselves quite relevant to the economy. Some of this as well is about similarly being able to help affect, we talked about that translation that our platforms are increasingly focused on between the language of the academy and the language of skills, the language of opportunity. But it's also something that needs to happen up front. We need to be able to make sure that students have a view before they select a program as to where that program is going to take them. And what we find is institutions who are able to actually engage students in that conversation are reporting that they're seeing much higher conversion rates than they were before that. We know that most institutions kind of studiously avoid talking about careers. It's an ugly word in a lot of institutions, and institutions are reluctant to get into vocational matters. It's a back of the house function. But the institutions that are able to engage students up front with that kind of language says, here's where this program is going to take you, these kinds of jobs, here's what the demand is for them. They are finding that students are hungry for that and are much more likely to to actually connect with that learning if they can see that there's a clear line of sight to opportunity at the other end. So those are examples of some of the ways that that we've been bringing our data in, to not just sort of have a resource, not just a reference book, if you will, to be part of key processes that are going on inside universities.
So let me ask you both one specific question that came in the chat. So Matt, maybe start with you. Continuing on this conversation, why do people continue to differentiate between education and training, particularly with the idea that education is superior? So kind of talk about, or based on what you just said.
Yeah.
That's interesting, right? And so how would you kind of answer that?
So I think that people are using a loose vocabulary, which is to say that I think we tend to associate the difference between training and education as being one of longitude and periodicity, right? So it's okay. Short things are training, long things are education, and we also use it as an inaccurate proxy for really for looking at the difference between pure academic education and things that include a work component. And of course, I think we realize today that we ought not necessarily to make that distinction. The idea that education is something that is necessarily bound to a degree that takes years to get has been part of what has narrowed access to so many students. When we say that to get education, you're going to have to make this giant leap of faith, particularly for those who don't have the means to make that leap of faith, that you're going to have to do something for years. And maybe then at the end of that, there may be some vague commitment to how that's going to better you. Then we close down the opportunity for people. When instead we can say, hey, look, education isn't about leaping tall buildings in a single bound. It's about acquiring skills, often paired with work. And as a result, you realize some of that benefit. When we can actuate those kinds of frames of education, then we can really achieve a lot. Opportunity America, which recently just put out which is a fabulous think tank, and I'm proud to serve on their board, recently came out with a study looking at so-called FAME programs, so advanced manufacturing education programs in Kentucky. It's sort of a microcosm. Nothing's necessarily special there about Kentucky and their FAME programs, just the ones that they studied. And they found that relative to other community college graduates who are making 5 years out $52,000 a year, FAME graduates who are in this kind of learn and earn model were making $99,000 a year on average 5 years out. That is absolutely life-changing. So the notion that we can change the structure of education, go beyond this kind of thought process of things having to be once and done, and instead help people learn as they go, acquire skills as they go, accrue benefit as they go, exercise those skills as they go, is actually key to opportunity and mobility for so many students who haven't had it.
Got it. So Jake, for you, this is a question that came up in the chat as well. How can companies like LinkedIn ensure that diverse talent doesn't stay stuck in the pipeline and actually moves forward to the interview or the offer stage? What can companies like LinkedIn do to help?
I'm again going to try to dodge the question because it's not my area of expertise within LinkedIn. So our talent solutions group has been focusing exactly on what you're describing. How do we not just encourage, but also empower employers to leverage LinkedIn to hire more diverse talent, more disadvantaged populations, to hire the way that we hire, to be frank, which is hopefully more skills-based and less based on somebody's name or the color of their skin or even their academic background. So again, I think if it's okay, I'll dodge that, but I might again pick up on what Matt was saying, because there's a bunch more to say on how how community colleges can adapt at what is probably the time when they're facing the greatest existential threat, I think, in the history of higher education. And it's because it can't be batch loaded anymore. It can't be a 2 or 4 year degree anymore. It has to be spanning across somebody's lifetime. And in the US, in some ways, community colleges are best positioned to take advantage of that structurally, if not necessarily either financially or based on what their faculty and administration and staff are capable of. And so the goal now is, how do we empower the community college to prepare itself to teach the way that Matt was just saying, or to teach the way that Khalid, you were just describing? And there's, I think, specific examples of how we can evaluate whether they're putting their money, so to speak, where their mouths are. An ISA is a great example. Like, if the student is only paying based on the educational outcome, the employment outcome, then of course the school is going to be a lot more motivated to achieve that employment outcome, to ensure the student gets the job that they're training them for. If, as Ryan Craig pointed out in his most recent piece, free tuition is not necessarily good because it might actually abstract from equality of opportunity and ensuring that community colleges are getting students into the jobs they need, not just getting students. I agree with that broad idea, but it's got to be continued into the idea that by unbundling, we actually are making schools more transparent. We are pushing them not just to teach online and adopt others' content and start working with employers more closely, et cetera. But yesterday, I Googled a university for the first time and in a while, and discovered that Google's search results are auto-including the salary outcomes, average salary outcomes for students, which I'd never seen before. But I think that's actually a really good thing. That's showing that I honestly also preferred the Wikipedia entry, because I think Wikipedia is probably one of the greatest bastions of what the internet should be, and that's no longer what Google's auto result is. But the ability to see those student outcomes is so important that I think, as Matt said, abstracting from them by using the term education and claiming that a post-secondary should just be teaching students in general, or teaching students to learn how to learn. Yes, that is the most important skill, but they also should be ensuring that those students are able to get employment no matter what kind of post-secondary they are.
So I know we've only got about 4 minutes left. So maybe a lightning round here. And I'll combine 2 or 3 of the questions that we got in the chat. What does good look like, right? So there's a question on kind of what are some good examples of community colleges? Can you role play and figure out how to engage with employers and all that? So maybe just combining some of that thought, what does good look like? Have you seen any good examples of colleges that are engaging on these topics in the right way, thinking about it the right way? Maybe just think about, and maybe Matt, we can start with you. What does good look like in your view? And how does that manifest in terms of engagement, interaction, curricular planning, et cetera?
So I think good I think there are a couple of dimensions of good. I think some of that is about evaluating your programs effectively. Some of it is about evaluating your curriculum effectively. Some of it is about empowering your students and faculty, and some of it is about engaging with employers. And so I sort of, just to say a sentence deep on each of those, given the time we've got. In terms of programs, one of I'm always was struck. I've seen this done a number of times, but for example, Bronx Community College, a couple of years ago, when New York City first put in place a $15 minimum wage, said, okay, what are the there's a bunch of programs we have that we're training people for $16 an hour jobs. That made sense when minimum wage was $10. Doesn't make sense at 15. How do you continue to reassess whether you've got the right programs? Schools like Western Governors, who have done a fabulous job of leveraging labor market data to be able to evaluate where their curriculum is lined up with success and where there may be gaps, and how do you then fill them out. I think about empowering students and faculty. Northern Illinois University is doing some fabulous work in helping students to listen to what employers are using labor market data to say, okay, what do employers want? What are the skills I need to be able to articulate, help them write better LinkedIn profiles, for example, and seeing some significant success there. Like as we talked before about how schools like USF and CCF and so many others Eastern Connecticut, who are empowering faculty or mandating faculty to go out and actually interact with the data. And then finally, I think in terms of employers, so much of this, so there was a question about how do you think about ontologies and how they intersect. The ability to go to employers and say to an employer, not just what are you looking for, and they give you the kind of standard bromides, I just want people who can think, but to be able to say, I'm looking for these specific sets of skills. Is that right? Leads to so much more of a engaged conversation than you normally get from the donut breakfast.
Got it. Jake.
Not an easy question and not an easy act to follow. I have a list of the institutions that I've been thinking about. A lot of them are up here in Canada because I'm just closer to the Canadian scene, particularly in higher ed. And before I jump into that, I just wanted to briefly talk about how, from a LinkedIn perspective, the way that I think institutions have done the best job of hiring diversity, to your earlier question, is by using labor market information in order to figure out which populations they need to be either hiring or as a post-secondary training. And I thought of a couple examples of how we've done that. You can just search for grads from HBCUs, right? You can just search for people who are from a particularly disadvantaged geography or from a particularly disadvantaged job, hired just from the hospitality sector right now. And I think it's thinking creatively about who you're hiring and why that is part of the answer. We have this tendency to sort of give up all of our agency and say, how can LinkedIn, i.e. the technical tool, do this? Practically speaking, we need to pull a lot of that agency back if we're going to save ourselves from what we're blaming as either a societal or a technological problem, but really is just us being lazy, to be totally frank. So that's part of it. To give a few examples, there was a community college in Manitoba, in rural Canada, in Winnipeg, called Red River College. And they were really scared because as the price of lynda.com increased, at some point they couldn't afford it. We came back with LinkedIn Learning and we said, look, can we transform your institution with you? And what they did was they just used us as the mechanism. They used online learning and LinkedIn Learning as the mechanism to undertake change management really right across the institution, so that it is now one of the most dynamic institutions in Canada, whether it's because of its online learning or because of its career development. And I think it's that kind of change that's necessary. San Jose State, every student when they start gets trained on how to use LinkedIn in order to represent themselves online, in order to how to learn how to network, and eventually to find a job on their first day of school. That helps the school because their reputation is now associated with all those students. And of course, it helps a student get a job. It doesn't have to be on LinkedIn. It could be another platform. But the point is to focus on career development and skills from day one. And finally, schools like Broward have forever had a reputation for being amazing at training disadvantaged populations. But their recent ability to engage employers to a much greater extent than other schools nearby, and to build, again, career development throughout their programming, I think is both unique and something that others can learn from.
Well, thank you both. This has been a fascinating conversation. I know we can go on for hours on this topic, but we're unfortunately out of time. Thank you both for joining me in this panel. I thank the organizers for having us on. I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation. I know up next we've got career life cycle sessions, preparing students' life cycle for the future of work. So I'll just kind of ask you all to keep engaging on this conversation, keep working on some of these issues that we laid out, and we're happy to help even after this session. I'm going to volunteer Jake and Matt, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to answer them.
Please do.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
have a good
Khalid, thanks so much, Jake. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Khalid. Bye for now.